My name is Sarah, a digital artist by profession and a homebody by choice. I take great pride in my work and an equal amount of pride in the small yet cozy house I own. That's why it was so significant for me to take the big step into marriage. The one I chose for this life altering journey was Mark, a corporate guy with a swagger that could fill a room. He was seemingly perfect, charming, smart, and from a reputable family. I thought I had hit the jackpot. But as the saying goes, all that glitters is not gold. And my wedding was the first place I saw the tarnish on what I thought was a golden life ahead. From the get go, planning the wedding felt like a struggle for control between me and my soon to be mother in law, Alice. She was a traditionally minded woman with a propensity for passive aggressive remarks. She insisted on a lavish, old fashioned wedding, drowning me in a sea of flower arrangements, table settings, and uncomfortable family traditions. On the day of the wedding, my anxiety was through the roof. I had managed to maintain a cheerful facade, but deep down, I knew something was off. Mark seemed distant, almost like he was a spectator at his own wedding. But what really broke me was Alice's behavior. As I stepped out of the car in my carefully chosen wedding dress, I could feel Alice's eyes on me, scanning me from head to toe. She sauntered over, and in a tone icy enough to give anyone chills, said, "Oh, Sarah, what an ugly shade of white your dress is. It hardly does anything for your complexion." I felt my face flush. It took every ounce of restraint I had to keep a smile plastered on my face. I glanced over at Mark, expecting him to intervene, but he remained silent, staring off into the distance. "Mom, let's just get through the day," he finally said in a tone so dismissive it felt like a slap in the face. Inside, the tension only escalated. Alice seemed determined to find fault with everything, from the music to the food. At one point, she took it upon herself to lecture my little sister on her table manners, a 12-year-old who was already nervous about the big day. "Alice, she's just a child," I intervened, trying to keep my voice steady. "Discipline starts young," she retorted, eyeing me as if I were the one in need of discipline. During the toast, Alice barely masked her disdain. She stood up, glass in hand, and said, "To Sarah and Mark, may you have a life filled with as much joy as this wonderful day." Her eyes met mine, and I knew wonderful was the furthest thing from her mind. Again, I looked to Mark for support. He raised his glass, but said nothing, his eyes avoiding mine, as if the love we professed was a lie we both chose to live. That's when it hit me. I was on my own in this marriage, wedged between a man who refused to stand up for me and a mother-in-law hell-bent on making my life miserable. The day that was supposed to mark the beginning of our happily ever after felt more like the prologue to a grim tale. As we drove off to our honeymoon, me clinging to my bouquet like a shield against the battles to come, I realized that this wedding was an omen, a prelude to the struggle that lay ahead. Mark was physically beside me, but in every way that mattered, I was horribly, dreadfully alone. That's how our marriage started, with the sinister undertones of a wedding that wasn't really a wedding but a theater of pretense. Little did I know that this was just the beginning and worse was yet to come. After the wedding and a strangely muted honeymoon, Mark and I moved into my house. I was thrilled at first. I'd always envisioned married life as an unbroken series of tender moments and shared laughter, a never-ending honeymoon of sorts. How naive I was! I had not accounted for Alice, who seemed to see my house as enemy territory she needed to conquer. Just weeks into our marriage, Alice began visiting regularly, arriving unannounced and pushing open the door as if she owned the place. Each visit was like a whirlwind of criticism and passive-aggressive comments that turned my peaceful abode into a combat zone. On one such occasion, I had just prepared dinner, carefully following a recipe I'd found online. I was excited to share it with Mark, but when Alice just breezed in, she took one look at the meal and scrunched up her nose in disapproval. "Sarah, when will you learn to cook like a real wife?" she said, poking at the lasagna as if it were a science experiment gone wrong. I clenched my jaw, forcing a smile. "Well, it's a new recipe. I thought Mark might like a change," I said. Alice smirked. Mark has been eating my cooking for years. He won't know what good food is if you keep serving him this slop. At that moment, I expected Mark to stand up for me, to tell his mother that he appreciated my efforts. Instead, he swallowed a bite of lasagna and almost mechanically nodded along with Alice. Mom's got a point, Sarah. The lasagna is a bit dry, he said. I felt my stomach sink. Mark's betrayal was 1,000 times more piercing than Alice's critique. One evening, Alice took it a step further. I had redecorated the living room, putting up new curtains and arranging the furniture in a way that maximized space and comfort. I was rather pleased with the result, but Alice, she had other thoughts. Who chose these curtains? They clash horribly with the furniture, she declared, eyeing the fabric as if it were contaminated. I chose them, actually. I thought they added a bit of color, I responded, my voice shaking more than I would have liked. Color? Is that what you call it? I call it a mess, Alice retorted, chuckling as if she'd said something profoundly witty. Mark, who had been flicking through a magazine, looked up briefly and said, Mom might be onto something, Sarah. Maybe you could use her help in choosing the next set. Of course she could, Alice chimed in, wearing a self-satisfied grin. After all, I have years of experience making a house a home. Her words, delivered in that grating tone of hers, felt like a slap in the face. This was my home, a place I had built long before Mark or Alice stepped into it. Yet it was being colonized one criticism at a time, and the person who was supposed to be my partner in this life journey was aiding and abetting the invasion. It was then that I realized if the man who vowed to stand by me was not just permitting this emotional sabotage. But even then, in that moment of agonizing clarity, I couldn't fathom the depth of my isolation, the extent to which these two people would go to shatter the sanctuary I had built. And so, amidst the battleground that my home was becoming, I kept waiting for things to improve, for Mark to finally take my side, for Alice to get tired of her own bitterness. In hindsight, I should have known better, for the next blow was about to land, a blow that would irrevocably shatter the shaky ground on which my marriage stood. The notion that things couldn't possibly get worse was a naivety I could no longer afford. And just when I thought I had acclimated to my new normal, the unthinkable happened. One evening, Alice showed up at our doorstep, not just with her usual bag of condescension, but with suitcases, boxes, and what seemed like half her house in tow. I've decided to move in, she announced, pushing her way past me into the living room. Excuse me, move in with us. I stammered, my eyes darting toward Mark, who seemed astonishingly unperturbed by this development. Well, yes, I'm getting older, and I'd like to spend more time with my son, Alice said, beginning to unpack her things as if the decision was already final. I looked at Mark, my eyes practically screaming for him to do something. Mark, can I talk to you for a moment? I pulled him aside, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Mark, this can't happen. She can't just move in. Our marriage is already strained, and her being here will make it impossible to mend anything, I whispered urgently. Mark sighed. Look, she's my mom, Sarah. She needs to be closer to her family now. We have to adjust. Adjust? I've been adjusting since day one, Mark. When will you adjust for me? When will you stand up for us? For our home, our marriage? The words poured out of me like a dam breaking. Mark looked away, avoiding my gaze. She's already here, Sarah. It would be rude to ask her to leave now. So there it was. Alice moved in, and with her came a nightmare I had not dared to imagine. Every day was a new battle. She criticized the way I arranged the furniture, how I did the laundry, even how I breathed. And each time Mark stood silently by, his apathy condoning her abusive behavior. But it wasn't just the daily nitpicking and criticisms that wore me down. It was the evident joy she took in making me miserable. One day, while cleaning the house, I discovered a bag of prescription medications hidden away in the kitchen cupboard. Pills for anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, the works. When I confronted her about it, she exploded. Who do you think you are snooping around my things? You are nothing, a guest in my son's life, and you have no business in my private affairs, she shrieked. A guest in my own house? The audacity was astonishing. But what was even more astonishing was that Mark, who had overheard the entire conversation, chose that moment to speak up, not in my defense, but in hers. Sarah, if my mom says they're private, then they're private. Stay out of it, he admonished, once again picking the wrong side of a very clear moral divide. It was a betrayal too great to comprehend fully, and I found myself numb, unable to react. That's when it dawned on me. Alice wasn't just a hostile mother-in-law. She was a predator, systematically breaking down my defenses and claiming my life as her territory. And Mark, he wasn't aloof or indifferent. He was complicit, actively or passively aiding her in the destruction of our marriage. In that moment, as I looked at Alice's triumphant smirk and Mark's avoiding eyes, I made a decision. I wouldn't just be a spectator in this tragedy. I would take control of my life, even if it meant breaking away from the people who were supposed to be my family. But as it turned out, fate had another curveball to throw my way, one that would finally compel me to act, to bring an end to this farce that my life had become. In the weeks following Alice's uninvited occupation of my home, my life devolved into a living nightmare. The constant surveillance, the petty criticisms, and the ever-looming shadow of my mother-in-law made each day an exercise in emotional survival. Her reign of terror expanded from mere commentary on my cooking and decorating to include personal jabs about my looks, my intelligence, and even my worthiness as a spouse. One evening, as we all sat in the living room, Alice began picking at another one of my failures. This time, it was my career, or according to her, my lack of one. You know, a good wife would contribute more than just bad cooking to her family. A job wouldn't hurt, you know. Not that you'd be qualified for anything worthwhile, she sneered. Though her words were like daggers, I couldn't let her see me bleed. I have a job, Alice, I retorted, and my income is just as crucial to this household as Mark's is. Is that so? She raised an eyebrow. Then why are we living in your shabby little house rather than a home that reflects the dignity of my son? Before I could muster a response, Mark, who had been engrossed in his phone, chimed in. Mom's got a point, Sarah. You could be doing more. We could be doing better. It felt like a sucker punch. Each syllable was a betrayal, each word a new crack in the already fragile foundation of our marriage. As I struggled to hold back tears, Mark got up, patting his mother on the back as he left the room, leaving me alone with the she-wolf who had infiltrated my life. With Mark gone, Alice leaned closer and whispered, "You see, he'll always be my son. You're just the girl he settled for." I turned away, my body trembling with a cocktail of fury and humiliation. My eyes fell on our wedding photo, a staged moment of Fox happiness. How had I ended up here? When had my love story turned into a grotesque theater of cruelty? The nightmare escalated when one day I found something alarming while cleaning the kitchen, a small packet of unidentified pills stashed behind the spice jars. My mind raced through the possibilities. When I confronted Alice about it, her reaction was nothing short of explosive. "How dare you invade my privacy, you insolent child? It's none of your business," she roared, her face red with fury. For the first time, I didn't hold back. "This is my house, Alice, and what you're doing is illegal. This affects me too." Just then, Mark entered the room, visibly annoyed. "What's going on here?" "Ask your wife. She's turned into a detective, snooping through other people's stuff." Alice spat, throwing me a venomous look. Mark turned to me, his voice icy. "Sarah, why can't you just let things be? Why are you causing problems?" That's when it hit me. There was no team in this marriage. Mark wasn't just failing to protect me. He was actively siding with the enemy. I felt like a stranger in my own home, suffocating under the weight of their combined disdain. But little did they know, their actions were only steeling my resolve. I would not be cowed. I would not let them break me. I would survive this nightmare and emerge stronger. And as events soon unfolded, I would get an unexpected opportunity to turn the tables, to finally reclaim my life and self-respect from the clutches of this unholy alliance. Mark's friend Jake was throwing a party, and despite my reservations about appearing in public as the happy couple, I was practically forced to attend. Maybe part of me also wanted a brief respite, a night off from the persistent nightmare that my home had become. "Come on, Sarah, it'll be good for us. We need a break," Mark insisted, his words more an instruction than a request. We arrived at Jake's lavish house, and for the first half hour or so, everything seemed normal. People laughed, glasses clinked, and music filled the air. But as the night wore on, I realized Mark was increasingly distant. He mingled, but more with others than with me. And when I did catch his eye, he seemed almost irritated by my presence. Then Mark vanished. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. After searching unsuccessfully among the guests, I started to check the less populated areas of the house. That's when I heard it. A soft giggle followed by a voice unmistakably Mark's. My heart sank even before I reached the door from which the sounds emanated. Taking a deep breath to brace myself for whatever lay beyond, I'd opened the door. There he was, Mark, entangled with another woman, neither of them noticing my entrance. For what felt like an eternity, when they finally did, the look on his face wasn't one of guilt or regret. It was annoyance. "Sarah, what the hell? Haven't you heard of knocking?" Mark snapped, as if I was the one in the wrong. "Knocking? Are you serious? What are you doing, Mark?" My voice trembled, not with sadness, but with fiery rage. "Just catching up with an old friend," he replied, a smirk replacing his initial annoyance. The room spun around me. Catching up? Is that what we're calling it now? I couldn't contain my contempt. His face turned red, a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "You're making a scene. Let's talk about this at home," he said. But I was done talking. I was done with the humiliation, the abuse, and the blatant disrespect. I stormed out, my entire body shaking. Mark didn't follow me. He didn't even call out as I left. I went home alone, my mind racing but surprisingly clear. A line had been crossed, a boundary irrevocably broken. The next morning, Mark sauntered into the house as if nothing had happened. It was then that Alice, ever the opportunist, decided to intervene. "I heard about last night," she began, her voice dripping with Fox concern. "You should know better than to embarrass yourself and my son like that." That was the last straw. "Embarrass me? You have the audacity to talk to me about embarrassment after everything you and your son have done." My voice rose, each word fueled by months of pent-up anger and frustration. Alice reached for her phone. "If you don't calm down, I'll call the police." "Go ahead," I said, locking eyes with her as I dialed my own number into the phone. "They might be interested in the package in the kitchen cupboard." Mark looked puzzled, then alarmed. But before he could say anything, the doorbell rang. As I opened the door to the police officers, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It was as if all the chaos, all the pain, had crystallized into this singular moment of clarity. It was time for my nightmare to end and for theirs to begin. The police officers were puzzled but professional. "We received a call about a domestic disturbance," one of them inquired. "Yes, and while you're here, I think you should check our kitchen cupboard. I found something that you might find interesting," I responded, meeting Alice's eyes as I spoke. Her face went ashen, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of fear replace her habitual sneer. "What is she talking about, Mom?" Mark looked from me to his mother, his confusion giving way to panic. "Mind showing us what you're referring to, ma'am?" The officer's gaze was stern but curious as I led them to the kitchen and pointed to the cupboard. Mark's voice wavered in a desperate tone. "Mom, what did you do?" The officers found the packet of pills and immediately turned to Alice. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us." "But those aren't mine," Alice stammered, her voice quivering with disbelief. "That can be sorted out later. For now, you are under arrest," the officer replied, cuffing her as she shot me a look of raw, impotent rage. After the police had taken Alice away, I turned to Mark, who seemed on the verge of a breakdown. Is this what you wanted, Sarah? To destroy this family? Destroy this family? I echoed incredulously. Mark, you and your mother destroyed this family long before today. You cheated on me, belittled me, allowed your mother to abuse me in my own home. The destruction was your doing, not mine. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. So what now? Divorce? Is that what you want? For the first time, Mark, it's not about what you or your mother want. It's about what I deserve. And yes, I deserve better than this farce of a marriage. Within weeks, the divorce proceedings were underway. I couldn't say it was a pleasant experience, but it was necessary. The trial that followed was the reckoning for both Mark and Alice. My soon-to-be ex-husband was exposed for the spineless enabler he was, while his mother received a 5-year prison sentence for possession of illegal substances. As I sat in the courtroom, watching Alice being led away, a wave of mixed emotions washed over me. Victory, certainly, but also a profound sadness for what could have, should have been a loving family. Mark caught my eye and looked away, unable to hold my gaze. The man I had married was a stranger, one I was finally free from. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the marble floor like the ticking of a clock. Each step took me further away from the nightmare my life had become. As I stepped into the sunlight, I realized that this was not just an ending but also a new beginning. The years that followed were about rediscovery and healing, and though the scars remained, they served as a constant reminder of my own strength, resilience, and self-worth. The nightmare was over, but the lessons it taught me would last a lifetime. I had faced the worst and survived, emerging not as a victim, but as a woman who would never again settle for anything less than what she deserved.